All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the closing conference for the first International Colloquium on the Metaphysics and Semantics of Fiction. Today we have Professor Yablo's conference, and I'm going to say a few words about his work in philosophy, and then we're going to have the conference. So Professor Yablo grew up in Toronto, Canada, where he got his bachelor in philosophy at the University of Toronto, and he did half of his master's at the University of Pune in India. He also completed his PhD in philosophy at UC Berkeley with George Miro and Donald Davidson. He's been professor of linguistics and philosophy since 1998 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and now he's the David W. Skinner Professor of Philosophy at the same institution. His research subjects are metaphysics, philosophy of mind, philosophical logic, epistemology, philosophy of language, and philosophy of mathematics. He has published 3 books: Thoughts, Papers on Mind, Meaning, and Modality in 2009, Things, Papers on Objects, Events, and Properties, 2010, and Aboutness, 2014. He has published almost 50 papers, including Mental Causation, Is Conceivability a Guide to Possibility, Go Figure, A Path Through Fictionalism, and The Myth of the Seven. Some of these papers were, according to Google Scholar, cited more than 1,000 times each. He also has delivered important lectures throughout his career, including the Gareth Evans Memorial Lecture at the University of Oxford in 2005, the John Locke Lectures at the University of Oxford in 2012, and the Whitehead Lectures at Harvard University in 2016. So it's clear that we're extremely honored to say that he's going to deliver the closing conference for the first International Colloquium on the Metaphysics and Semantics of Fiction. His conference is entitled Conditioning on Existence. So Professor Yablo, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. And just from hearing the last 3 talks, which is unfortunately all I could make, I realized that I've missed a great deal, and I've really enjoyed both the talks and the discussion. And I can sort of pick up that there's a lot of sort of themes and currents running through the community that you've built up over these last few days, and I'm envious and admire what you've accomplished. So that's great. I realize that in some ways the talk I'm going to give is in some ways the opposite of the theme of your conference, because it's not about the metaphysics of existence, but the metaphysics of fiction, but the kind of way to avoid metaphysics with regard to at least certain sorts of fictional entities. So I'm going to be, I guess I should say, right to begin with, because there has been quite a bit of talk about the abstract artifact view, that I'm going to be sort of ignoring views that, according to which, in say that Falstaff doesn't exist, you're really not attributing non-existence, but you're just saying Falstaff isn't the kind of thing that you might expect, or doesn't have the properties that he's credited with in the play. I'm going to be saying, Falstaff just doesn't exist, period. So if you don't like that view, this is a good time to leave or shut off your video. But I'm going to sort of just take these sorts of claims at face value. All right, so singular non-existence claims are mystifying. There's at least 3 reasons for this, probably more. The first is what I'll call the problem of aboutness. So you've got this claim, Vulcan does not exist. What's it about? Not the planet, there is no such thing. Is it about the term, as Frege at one early point suggested? Is it about the concept, as Frege also at a later point suggested? Is it about an abstract artifact, a failed posit, as some people, I think Salmon uses this language? The second problem is, suppose that it is about the term or the concept or an abstract artifact. Certainly doesn't seem like it ascribes emptiness to a name or non-planethood to an abstract artifact. How could our aboutness intuitions be so off? I call it the problem of indirection. We wind up talking about not just about an object, but attributing a property that it doesn't seem like we're attributing. Finally, there's the problem of equivocation, and exists ought to, and being a proper name, ought to say the same whether it's true or false. Well, Vulcan exists if it's true, ascribes existence to a concrete object, a planet V. But if false, it clearly is not going to be ascribing existence to a planet V. There is no such planet. So all of a sudden it's ascribing, say, referringness to a name or instantiatedness to a concept, but then there's a change in topic. And this seems to create a problem because we think the people that disagree about whether Vulcan exists are sort of in logical contact with each other. We don't want to say they're talking past each other. But then it should be that the proposition whose truth would vindicate one is the same as the proposition whose falsity would vindicate the other. But that isn't the case in any of these views, because if the claim is true, then it's a singular proposition about a concrete object that vindicates these, a Vulcan affirmer, whereas it's a proposition about some other entity that vindicates the Vulcan denier. Okay, so now Ken Walton, who you can see a picture of him at age 6 or something in the margin, sitting on a hobby horse. He's got that on the web somewhere, called My Early Experiments with Make-Believe. So Ken Walton sketches a pretense account of existence and non-existence claims that seems at first to help with all three of these problems. He says, to say, this is a paper called Existence as Metaphor, ? He thinks it isn't really quite a metaphor, but won't get into exactly why that is. It has a lot of the same mechanics. His account has some of the same mechanics as his account of metaphor. He says, to say Falstaff doesn't exist is to say, Falstaff, that didn't work. The demonstrative that refers to the kind of attempted reference illustrated by the utterance of the name. So it's a pretense account because the attempted reference is only a pretended attempt. You're not really attempting because you don't really think you're going to succeed, but you're putting on display a type of attempted reference. And so there we've got Walton shouting Falstaff, this is in the margin. And then the content of the non-existence claim, that sort of puts on display a certain kind of attempted speech act, and then the rest of the content is thumbs down. That didn't work. It's a little bit like Davidson's paratactic analysis of belief attributions, or saying that, where when I say Galileo said that the Earth moves, it's like the Earth moves. Period. Galileo said that. There's really these two speech acts that are sort of done in tandem, except in Walton's case, the first speech act is not sentence length. It's just like blurting out Falstaff. Okay. So how does this help or seem to help with the problems? I'm trying to tread carefully here because I think it doesn't really help all that much, but it helps a little bit. So aboutness. So the sentence Vulcan doesn't exist is not itself about anything, nor does it describe any feature, but speakers, when they use the sentence, are saying of a type of referring attempt that it doesn't come off. So there's at least a subject matter to the speech act, if not to the sentence. Equivocation. Well, Vulcan exists, if it's true, does not ascribe existence to Vulcan. There is no such property according to Walton. That's why he thinks existence talk isn't metaphorical, because there's no literal content to the word exists. It's just the device for engaging in the kind of two-part speech act I mentioned before. Why there should be such a device, or what suits the word existence to play that role, he doesn't really say. He just sort of says, maybe it could go like this. Vulcan exists if true does not ascribe existence. The asserted content is that the act of attempted reference did work. So you're saying the same kind of thing in both cases. You put a kind of attempted reference on display, and then you say of it either that it did work or it didn't work. Indirection. So a Waltonian could say that it feels like we're talking about a planet because we're pretending to do so when we pretend to attempt to refer with the word Vulcan. Semantic phenomenology arguably is dictated, at least some of the time, by what one is making as if to do, as opposed to what one is really doing. All right, now some worries. So on his answer to aboutness, or what I'm putting in his mouth as the answer to aboutness, we may have something to talk about on the disavowal theory, which is what I'm calling Walton's theory, but it's the wrong thing. We're supposed to be talking about Vulcan, not an act of attempted reference. Reindirection. Look, I mean, the idea that phenomenology goes more with what we as if do than what we really do is not clearly right. So suppose I say, you'll finish this job or die trying. That's taken at face value a prediction. So it seems like I'm pretending to make a prediction in order to make a threat. I'm threatening you by saying you'll finish the job, by predicting, so to speak, that you'll die trying if you don't finish the job. But it doesn't feel like a prediction. It feels like a threat. And oftentimes when we engage in indirect speech, it's actually, what's hard is to actually recover the literal, what we're really doing as opposed to what we're making as if to do. There are examples going the other way as well. Like, so for instance, yeah, I mean, another example that goes the way I'm saying is, suppose I say, he's not the smartest guy in town, right? It takes some work to recover that what I've said is compatible with his being the second smartest guy in town, right? It sounds like I'm saying he's not that smart at all. Okay, so again, it's not clear. You can just assume the phenomenology goes with what you're making as if to do. Another example where maybe it does is what people sometimes talk about is the curious plural that we use with identity. We say, like, if I say Hesperus is phosphorus, and someone says, oh, that's not interesting, you're just saying that a thing is itself. I'll say, you're not understanding me. Hesperus is one thing, phosphorus is another thing. I'm saying they're identical. And there is a definite phenomenology of plurality. And on some accounts, Mark Crimmins has an account like this, you're pretending that there are these two different things, a separate object for each mode of presentation. And you're pretending that identity is a relation that obtains between two separate things. It's sort of saying these two things are, well, he calls it the pretense that identity is a promiscuous relation that can relate distinct items. Okay. Re-equivocation. Look, if the topic of true existence claims were referring attempts, then I think, therefore I am, would be like a straight up fallacy. Because I am, on Walton's account, describes a referring attempt as successful. But I think does not describe a referring attempt as thinking, right? There, I presumably am talking about myself and saying that I think. So it should just be like a complete fallacy of equivocation. But I think, therefore I am, is like widely regarded as one of the most plausible seeming arguments in philosophy. It ought to just seem like a straight up change of topic, if Walton was right. Okay, so here's the dialectics of the situation. We've got a thesis. And this is Walton's thesis. In saying that Vulcan does not exist, one pretends to attempt to speak of Vulcan, knowing that any such attempt is successful. The antithesis is that this is just what seems intuitively right, even though we know it can't be right, or we think we know it can't be right. Vulcan doesn't exist has the literally true content, which in some way does speak of a planet Vulcan. These two seem incompatible. The only way to reconcile them would be to find a form of speech such that, find a kind of sentence such that pretense figures in our cognition and evaluation of the sentence's literal content. Does it ever happen elsewhere in philosophy that pretense figures in our cognition or evaluation of a sentence's literal content? Well, as a matter of fact, it does happen. So take, according to the story Q, according to the Holmes story, Holmes wrote a monograph on cigar ash. That's supposed to be literally true. But to evaluate it, we imagine that, and then you just plug in the Holmes relevant story. And then you ask, under the scope of that imagining, whether he wrote a monograph, whether we're to imagine that he wrote a monograph on cigar ash. So that's a good start, but the problem is that Holmes does not exist is not plausibly. I mean, it's a good start as far as showing that there's no contradiction between saying that a sentence is literally true and that we engage in pretense in processing and evaluating it. But unfortunately, Holmes does not exist, is not plausibly analyzed as according to some story. Certainly, according to the Holmes story, he does exist. Second try. According to the P story, Q is sometimes analyzed as a conditional if P, Q. Of course, Lewis says it's a counterfactual conditional. You might argue that an indicative conditional would be a better candidate because on the Lewis story, it's not clear that it should be. So we're mostly inclined to think that it's true in the Holmes stories that Holmes is actually a brilliant detective. But on the normal way of thinking about actuality and counterfactuals, it's not the case that were the stories true or told as known truth, there would actually be this detective, Holmes. Because actually is a device for taking us back to the actual world, right? Whereas, so you can't just stick in actually in the consequent of a counterfactual conditional. You can stick it into the consequent of a indicative conditional. Like, if the stories are true, then Holmes is actually a detective. That's just as good as then he's a detective. Okay. But let's, I'll just say that to put it aside. So we could take if P, then Q as a candidate for how to analyze a form that we could use to analyze Holmes doesn't exist. But it's not clear what P and Q should be to get us to Holmes doesn't exist. Also, where's the pretense? Okay. Now we're going to get subtraction. So here's my third try aimed at where's the pretense. Recall the so-called Ramsey test for indicative conditionals. So Ramsey famously says, it's in the margin, if people are arguing, if P, will it be that Q, and both are in doubt as to P, they are adding P hypothetically to their stock of knowledge and arguing on that basis about Q. Ramsey says that in Truth and Probability, 1931. In Quine, the element of pretense is closer to the surface. P than Q for Quine is, I love this phrase, a dramatic idiom processed by feigning belief in P and seeing how convincing we then find Q. In fact, one heuristic here is you imagine that a reliable informant comes to you and says, P. Say, okay, and so now thus enlightened, I now ask myself, what do I now think about Q? Okay, so now we've got some pretense into the interpretation of if P then Q as literally understood, but still, as P does not exist amenable to a paraphrase along the lines of if P then Q? Well, fourth try. So take so-called monkey's uncle conditionals. People say, no one actually ever says this, but it sort of persists as an example that linguists use. If P, then I'm a monkey's uncle, or if P, then I'll eat my hat. I once had a colleague at Michigan who said, confusing, I think, two idioms like this is, if P, then I'll eat myself, which I think it was like he was getting I'll eat my hat mixed up with then I'll kick myself or something like, I don't know, something like that. So if P, that I'm a monkey's uncle, is used to deny that P, more generally to assert that if P then, and this is the logical symbol for the absurd, where that's a acknowledged absurdity is tantamount to asserting not P. And indeed, in logic, negation is often defined in these terms. Not P is often defined by intuitionists, for example, as if P, then absurd. Okay, so now here's our synthesis. Here's how we synthesize the idea that Vulcan does not exist has a literally true content, which does speak of Vulcan in some sense, and that one pretends to speak of Vulcan, knowing that any such attempt is unsuccessful. You let n does not exist be analyzed as if n exists, or suppose n exists, then crash and burn, then something absurd happens. In other words, so you make as if to assume that n exists, and then you draw out the consequences, and boom, you crash into the wall. And that's what happens. You're doing this sort of two-part exercise of assuming that n exists, which you can do by imagining someone comes and tells you that. And then, uh-oh, I goofed. But the thing is, this isn't just a two-sentence pragmatic exercise, as in Walton. It's a sentence of English. If n exists, then blah. So call this per absurdism. This, like the disavowal account, has us making as if to do something en route to critiquing that very act. But it has some prima facie advantages over the disavowal view. First is aboutness. When we hypothesize that Vulcan exists, we take ourselves to be thinking about Vulcan. But this is correct, for we are on the hypothesis that Vulcan exists, especially operationalized as someone coming and telling us. Can you believe it? Vulcan exists. We are, under that pretense, thinking about Vulcan, because we take ourselves to just have been informed that Vulcan exists, and so we take the word to refer. And thereby we take our own use of it to be referential, even in thought. Indirection. No surrogate object is forced on us as the thing really under discussion on this per absurdist alternative. Vulcan is treated as under discussion because we are, at least while processing the antecedent of the conditional, which is part of processing the conditional, thinking about Vulcan imagined to be the referent of our Vulcan thoughts under the scope of this pretense that Vulcan exists. We're fully entitled to imagine that. Because when we imagine that we've just been told that Vulcan exists, we're imagining the word Vulcan refers, we're imagining that it refers to Vulcan. What else? So we're imagining there's this thing Vulcan, which we're referring to when we use the word Vulcan. Finally, equivocation. A proposition should exist that ontological disputants can be seen as disagreeing about the truth value of. Well, why not? If Vulcan exists, then absurd. Leverrier rejects it. He thinks if Vulcan exists, then everything is just as it is. Let's just suppose he actually believes the hypothesis, which I don't think he did. He rejects it, and we accept it. A shared interest in that proposition is what saves us from talking past each other. And that shared proposition has the right subject matter. We're thinking about Vulcan when we think, well, if Vulcan exists, then uh-oh. Okay, now some objections, and then I'll stop. This is an objection that Walton makes. So there's this idea that we're supposed to pretend that Vulcan exists, that Holmes exists en route to thinking that Holmes does not exist. What could it be in the absence of Holmes even to pretend that Holmes exists? So that's why Walton always says, look, I'm really talking about a pretense of kind K. You shouldn't think about it as the pretense that Holmes exists because there's no such individual as Holmes. We don't even know what that pretense would be. It would be like pretending that Glumph, where Glumph is nonsense, and Holmes exists is nonsense too, given that Holmes doesn't exist. And here I think he's sort of like taking Kripkean strictures way too seriously. We can oftentimes pretend stuff that doesn't actually make sense as long as we're also pretending other stuff whereby it does make sense. So here's another, I'll just mention this example off to the side. This example from Stolnaker. Suppose I think a room is empty. I can pretend that there are two people in it. While pretending there are two people in it, I can pretend that they're both hungry. They're both hungry presupposes there are two people. How could you do that? Well, you can't do it out of the blue. I can't, point to an empty room and just say, I'm pretending they're both hungry. But if I prefigure that pretense with, I'm pretending there's two people in the room, then I can pretend they're both hungry because I've got these two people, right? And this is the kind of thing that happens in linguistics all the time. There's a phenomenon called modal subordination. I dreamed that someone broke into my house and that she was furious at me, okay? I can use the word she anaphorically. It's licensed by the quantifier. Someone broke into my house. That's sort of the essential insight of like so-called discourse representation theory or file change semantics. Okay, so under the scope of the imagining, where I've just been reliably informed homes exist, I'm in the right kind of causal contact with this guy to enable de re thoughts about him. So why shouldn't I pretend that homes exist? It's true that if you just describe the pretense as homes exist, it's not clear how I access it, but if I pretending that I've just been truly informed that Holmes exists, now I can imagine that he has certain other properties. Second, the Holmes hypothesis is not absurd. Where's the contradiction that we're supposed to be able to get on the basis of the supposition that Holmes exists? Well, so here's my best shot at saying what that contradiction would be. And then in the third objection, I'll kind of back off the idea that there has to be a contradiction. If Holmes exists, right? Well, there are these certain things that are the existing things. Let's suppose we've got a list of them: A0, A1, A2, A3, etc. For each of them, arguably, there's a case to be made that Holmes, even if he exists, is not that individual. In other words, you go down every existing thing, there's going to be a case that we could make that Holmes, even if he exists, that is not a good candidate for what he would be. So Kripke actually makes this point in his Locke lectures. He says, without being sure of whether Sherlock Holmes was a person, I think he says was a person because he thinks Sherlock Holmes does exist in some sense or in certain uses of that term. But let's just take that to mean he doesn't, without being sure whether there is such an individual as Sherlock Holmes, we can say none of the people in this room is Sherlock Holmes, for all are born too late, and so on. So his idea is that, Sherlock Holmes, if he exists, is like a 19th century figure, but nobody here in this room, suppose we're all in a room, is a 19th century figure. So that's why Sherlock Holmes, he's nobody in this room. And he also uses the example of Bandersnatches. He says, whatever Bandersnatches may be, certainly there are none in Dubuque. Dubuque is this town in, I've forgotten, Iowa, I think. It's this town in the United States. I kind of like that's kind of the way you Americans, where is Dubuque? Is it in Iowa or somewhere else?
I think it's Iowa. I believe so.
You think it's Iowa? Okay. And are there any Bandersnatches there? As far as you know? No. Anyway, it seems like once you bring it down to earth and you say, let's go through Dubuque, you say, all I find here is like Jiffy Lubes and Dunkin' Donuts and people and so on, and not even if there are Bandersnatches, this is not what they are. Kripke actually has tells a story somewhere where he imagines that Lewis Carroll wrote Jabberwock as an actual factual report that as a kid he was taken to a park and he was introduced to some scary animals that he was told were Bandersnatches. and he didn't realize they were just like a very scary kind of dog or something like that. He was really trying to describe them. Um, um, but even if that's true, we could still say that these objects, none of them are Bandersnatches, the ones in Dubuque. So that's just talking about the room or the objects in Dubuque. It's not like we in the room are uniquely ill-qualified to play the Holmes role. Does not every existing thing have properties given which Holmes is not that thing, even supposing him to exist? In other words, even if he existed, he would be surely a further thing. Reality would be, so to speak, reality is different from how it really is on the hypothesis that Holmes exists. So the contradiction is that, one, Holmes, if he exists, is one of us, one of the AKs, while at the same time, there is nowhere among us an AK such that Holmes, if he exists, is AK. All right, third objection. Why so sure? Why couldn't some AK be such that Holmes, if real, is that individual? In other words, some attested individual. So Holmes was supposedly based on this guy named Joseph Bell, a, quote, scientific surgeon who worked at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, for whom Doyle had in fact clerked. Someone might think Bell was so much the best candidate for the role that even though Holmes doesn't exist, nevertheless, if he does exist, he is Bell. That's how he would be. Now, in fact, Doyle actually discusses this in some letters. He says that he was not writing about Bell, and he actually considers himself a better candidate for the role than Bell. But let's just take this sentence. I was not writing about Bell, or he was not writing about Bell. We can all agree about that. That's like an acknowledged truth, not W. But then if we're to suppose that if Holmes exists, that he is Bell, we'll be supposing that if Holmes exists, then a falsehood W holds, namely he's writing about Joseph Bell. Well, that could be enough for our purposes. That all by itself gets us by modus tollens that Holmes does not exist. Because if Holmes exists, then he's writing about Bell on this hypothesis. But he's not writing about Bell. We all agree about that. So we've got, if Holmes exists, then falsehood. But then by modus tollens, that gets us Holmes does not exist. So even if the counterexample is accepted, the analysis might only have to be tweaked. Negative singular existentials would take the form, if Holmes exists, then F for some falsehood F or other, not necessarily for the specific falsehood, the absurd that we were using in the first version of the analysis. That would be good enough. We had analyzed Holmes does not exist as there is a falsehood such that if Holmes exists, then F. Or in other words, if Holmes exists, then things are not how they actually are, which already, is absurd, because analytically things are how they actually are. But the point is that in contemplating the hypothesis that Holmes exists, we're contemplating a scenario where the world is different from how we know it is. That's enough by modus tollens to get Holmes does not exist. Okay, I think that's all I've got. So I finished early and lots of time for questions, if any. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Professor Yablo. Now we have time for questions. As usual, you can just raise your hand. Awesome. So we have Hannah.
Great. Hi, Steve. Thank you for the talk.
Hi.
A lot of fun.
I heard a talk you co-wrote the other day.
Oh, sorry?
I heard a talk you co-wrote the other day.
Oh, which one was it?
The one at the Walton, the one for the Walton volume.
Oh, cool. Got it. Yeah. Neat.
I was interested.
Oh, thank you. So very different topic, not poetry here. I guess I'm not convinced about the absurdity point. So I want to push, I guess with the third objection or the second or third, kind of anticipation of the objection by pointing to historical fiction. So like, say an author is being true to everything we do know in history, and whether it's about Napoleon or Anne Boleyn, whatever, it seems like it wouldn't be absurd such that, like, if the fictional character were to exist, it would actually be that historical figure, or at least that's the intent, right? To get us to imagine. It'd be really weird if we said like the Napoleon, I actually haven't read War and Peace, so I shouldn't use that example, but say like if Anne Boleyn existed, it'd be absurd for her to be the person that was written about, just maybe surprising, but not absurd. And so, I mean, so curious what you would say about that. And I guess at the very least, your view would commit us to particular views on historical fiction. So that might be like a ramification to like think about.
Well, you're saying this to someone who's reading the Hilary Mantel novels about Thomas Cromwell and the death of Anne Boleyn right now. So, but no, look, I think this case is handled perfectly, because Anne Boleyn, the person who Hilary Mantel is writing about it, you know, there's these novels that right now about Henry VIII and his wives. Anne Boleyn did exist, so I don't want it to be the case that if Anne Boleyn exists, then absurd, and it isn't. If Anne Boleyn exists, then everything is just as it is. So in other words, I don't. The prediction that you're saying I'm missing is a false prediction, so I'm happy to miss it. She exists. But there might be cases where one is inclined to think that a fictional character is definitely modeled on a real individual, but never, maybe even has the same name, but is not that real individual. And maybe that's the kind of example that you could use. Yeah.
Yeah, got it. That makes sense to me. I'll think about that.
Yeah, I mean, there might be cases where like take the opera Nixon in, well, no, I was thinking the opera Nixon in China, but I guess that is really supposed to be Nixon. But there might be cases where I think Philip Roth has some novels like this where somebody is, you know, there might be like a Hitler character, say,
right, like
but
satire, yeah.
Yeah, or maybe like Charlie Chaplin, the great dictator. He's like wearing the mustache and all that, you know, the movie. You know, he's not really supposed to be Hitler, but well, you see how hard I'm trying to give you an example that supports your objection, and I'm not coming up with it, but I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are. Yeah.
Yeah, no, okay, that gives me a lot to think about. Thanks.
Awesome. Professor Voltolini?
Thanks a lot, Stephen. There's a lot of things to think about. But I think I have the same worry as Anna. That is, I'm a bit worried about the absurdity issue for concerning the idea that there is a contradiction. Let me pretend that I am Graham Priest for the time being, so that I take that the names in question actually refer to merely possible entities, right? So one might say, well, I'm not sure whether there is a contradiction there. It depends on how you read the quantifier, which is in the second sentence of the contradiction. If the quantifier is restricted to the subdomain of the existent beings too is true. But if the quantifier is non-restricted, it ranges over any item whatsoever, then it seems that 2 is false. For one might say, well, indeed there is someone who is among us in a way, because it's a possible entity. A possible entity is an entity precisely like us, of the same kind, Graham would say that it's a concrete entity, and we are concrete entities that simply exist, and Vulcan is simply a concrete entity that does not exist. And
why can't I say
so
the same thing that I said to Hannah and say, look, I said, I'm assuming that Holmes doesn't exist. You've got a hypothesis where Holmes exists. You're saying, on your theory, Holmes exists. So therefore, if you're using my theory, you wouldn't want my theory to give the result that if Holmes exists, then absurd. And it doesn't, on your view, give that result. So in other words, people the theory is available for use by people with different views of Holmes's existence. I think Holmes doesn't exist, so I'm happy that when I apply my theory, I get the result that he doesn't exist, because I get if Holmes exists, then absurd. You think he does exist, so you should be happy applying my theory to get the result that that conditional doesn't hold.
Well, it depends. I might agree with you that Holmes does not exist in a sense. It exists in another sense, as Meinongian would say, for instance, and even model Meinongians, I would say. You have to split the predicate, the existent predicate. Well, things become more complex, of course. Yeah.
Well, then one could capture both senses by saying Holmes exists in the. If you want to capture Holmes exists in the sense in which it's false, we let us range over the things in this world. If we want to capture the sense in which it's true, we let us range over the things in all possible worlds. If we're, modal realists and we think all those things are concrete,
Awesome. Well, I have a question. I'm going to raise my hand now. Okay. Professor Yablo, thank you very much for your conference. I have some general questions, actually, that were related to the contributed papers that we saw earlier. I see that you are relying a lot, as we all know, on Kendall Walton's work in order to put forward pretense in the way we deal with fiction. And I'm just curious to know, how does this theory deals with metafictional utterances like Sherlock Holmes is a fictional detective? I remember that Professor Thomason, in her 2003 paper, speaking of fictional characters, put forward the objection that such utterances that she calls external, I think, don't involve pretense. And Walton says that it's just an ad hoc game of make-believe, but I'm not sure if that's quite convincing. So I would like to ask you if you have a way out of this problem for those who say that fictional objects don't exist. So how do we deal with metafictional utterances? And I have a second question, but I'm going for this one first. And thank you once again.
Okay, I don't mind hearing your second one. It's up to you. Should I answer the first one? Or?
It's because it depends on your answer right now.
No. So whatever comes next is my fault. All right.
No, it isn't.
So Walton has a distinction between two kinds of make-believe, two spirits in which you can make a make-believe utterance. On the one hand, there's so-called content-oriented make-believe. That's where I can't remember what you called it, but it's sort of like an intrafictional utterance, like where you say, Raskolnikov murdered the pawnbroker. You pretend that that's so. In the course of engaging in what Walton would say is the official make-believe game for the novel. Now, you could also use Raskolnikov. So Walton thinks that what's pretense-worthy in a make-believe game is usually not something that's sort of pulled out of thin air, but depends on the properties of certain real objects, what he calls the props. So in this case, the prop might be, the novel. So you could imagine a critic saying, you can imagine a bad critic saying, No, he doesn't really he doesn't kill the pawnbroker. He just roughs her up a bit, and that would be false. Okay. Why would it be false? Because the critic would be trying to correct someone else's reading of the novel. They say, no, the sentences that are really written down there actually don't license the pretense that he killed her. I hope I'm not mixing up novels. I probably am. So you can. So we could argue about the sentences written down in a novel, but where you say, no, he killed her. I say, no, he just roughed her up a bit. Or she doesn't actually die. He just, threatens her. And you'd be right and I'd be wrong about the novel. So this shows that you can sometimes engage in pretense where what you're saying is disciplined. Sorry, the aim of what you're saying is to elaborate what's to be pretended in the game. Another thing you can be doing is to try to give information about the props by saying the props are in such and such a condition whereby they license the pretense that I'm currently engaged in. That's how Walton thinks. So if I say, for instance, looking at a painting, I say, this haystack is badly done. It's smeared. Or this isn't Van Gogh's best haystack. It's badly done. I'm pretending momentarily that there's a haystack there in order to make a comment on the paint on the canvas and say that it's inexpertly applied. Okay. Now that's how Walton thinks metaphor works. So when I say Crotone is in the arch of the Italian boot, you don't experience that as a pretense because I'm clearly trying to give you information about where Crotone really is. And there's a very superficial pretense that Italy is a boot that you kind of engage in without even noticing it. En route, what I'm really telling you is Crotone is in a certain place. Which place? The place where you'd imagine it to be if you were imagining Italy as a boot. But you don't even run through that imagining. You may not even realize that just like if I say that was a perfect day, that's hyperbolic. It wasn't really perfect. There could have been one more bluebird twittering in the tree, right? I'm pretending to say that it was a literally perfect day in order to convey that it was fantastic. But nobody says, oh, you don't mean that. You're not saying that it's God. Only God is literally perfect, right? We know how to, so oftentimes we see through the pretense to what the person was literally saying, seriously affirming, which is the props were in a condition to license this kind of pretense. Now, when someone says Holmes is a fictional detective, they're saying the prop is a certain work of fiction. And they're describing that prop, on Walton's view, as licensing the pretense that Holmes is a detective. What they're really talking about is, what they're really saying is, there's this book out there that's in a certain, so they could say, look, the sentence Holmes is a detective is literally in the book somewhere. But that would be a rash thing to say because that very sentence probably isn't in the book. What they really are trying to say is the book, construed as a report of real events, reports that there's this guy Holmes who's a real detective. It's a fantastic, just as metaphor can be a great way of giving highly rarefied sort of information about the real world that it might be hard to convey literally. Holmes is a fictional detective is a way of stating this huge disjunction, if you like, of all the sentences that could be written in a book, any of which would license the claim that Holmes is a detective. And we engage in that pretense for the same reason as we engage in a lot of other kinds of pretenses. That we have no way of literally saying what all the sequences of sentences are that would license that pretense. So we're really just, when we say Holmes is a fictional detective, we're just saying, there's these kinds of sentences in the book, the kind that license that pretense. That's what I think Walton would say. There's nothing unserious about it. It's deadly serious. In fact, it's so serious that we are willing to like pretend to quantify over non-existent entities in order to have access to this content that we want to seriously assert.
Awesome. Thank you very much. My second question was actually dismantled by your response. So I'll think a little bit more, and after Hishan, I'm going to think of something else. But thank you very much. It was
I'm
awesome.
willing to change the answer so as to facilitate your second objection.
Would you like to?
I deny that. I deny that what I just said. So yeah, I'm happy to
Are you
hear it.
becoming an artifactualist? Hannah is asking for us to stop the screen share. Yes, we can. There we go. And now Hishan, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yablo, for an interesting talk. And I have a question about pretense and the paradox of fiction. So this is something that I mentioned during my talk, but I must admit that I don't have a good answer to that paradox yet. So maybe you do. So as you know, pretense theorists would probably argue that emotions evoked by certain works of fiction are merely quasi emotions, so they're not real. But I would say that phenomenologically speaking, these emotions are just the same as emotions that would be evoked while being in a real life situation. And sometimes even I would say that these emotions evoked by fiction are stronger than some emotions in real life. For example, someone might be emotionally invested in the death of Anna Karenina, even more so than for example, in the context of the death of some, complete stranger to you. So how would you explain this paradox and its connection to pretense?
Good. I admit that through part of your question, which was very interesting, I was trying to answer Hannah's comment in the comments that we should stop the screen share, and I wasn't able to do it. So I'm sorry about that. Someone knows how to stop the screen share.
Would you like me to repeat the question? Or?
No, I think I,
okay. Okay.
Yeah. So your question is, why do we have such profound emotional responses to fictional characters? I believe Putnam talks about the example of, I don't know if this is really true, it seems like the kind of thing that philosophers like to believe so much that they believe it even if it wasn't true. But I think it is actually true that people sometimes commit suicide in Japan over unrequited love for a fictional character. Has anyone heard about that? I don't know. Putnam claims that anyway. Yeah. This might be one of those cases. I don't really know the answer to that. It's a fantastic question, and it's. I know it's much discussed, and I'm sure people have, like, other people might have more to say about it than I would. But I think this might be one of those cases where the phenomenon, like earlier I said, look, often the phenomenology goes with what you're really doing as opposed to pretending to do. But this might be one of those cases where the phenomenology goes with what you're pretending to do. You're pretending to read a real report of events involving somebody in tragic circumstances. And it could be that you're, I don't know, and here I'm just making this up. I'm hoping someone's going to save me that's actually thought about this. It could just be, and that your subpersonal systems, so to speak, are just set up so that exposed to this kind of material, they draw forth certain kinds of emotions. And you're not inferring your way to this person deserves my sympathy, or this person deserves my love. It's sort of a visceral reaction. And people often make the point that with regard to testimony, say, that contrary to what you might suppose if you read too many analytic philosophers, people don't hear testimony and say, okay, so that person just said that blah, so now should I believe it? Asking in the meantime whether that person is reliable. People hear things, they believe it on the whole, although that belief can be defeated if they get sort of collateral evidence that the person is lying or it's just too implausible. Well, similarly, it might be that when you read something, you, at some level, accept it without yet deciding whether the acceptance will take the form of, I'm really gonna hold on to this forever, or I'm gonna go with this for now and assess its credibility later. If you're in that kind of state, it seems to me that I talk about this in connection with metaphor and in other writings. A lot of times, a lot of the sentences that we process have this maybe metaphorical status where we're sure they're true somehow or other, but we're not sure whether the truth is literal or metaphorical. So if someone says, this product has achieved great market penetration, like sort of advertising speak, I might say, yeah, that's true, you can get this product anywhere. Do I really believe in market penetration? I don't know. Hopefully I don't have to decide that before deciding that the sentence is acceptable. When I say that someone has tingles in their legs, this is Dennett's example, I don't ask myself first whether I literally believe in tingles or not. So I would think in a similar way, oftentimes when we're processing kind of discursive information, we reserve judgment, so to speak, on the issue of whether it's really true, and just sort of apply our sensibility to, let our sensibility run over it. And that would have the result that you would sometimes get ahead of yourself and feel these emotions. It doesn't really quite answer your question, because oftentimes, even after I'm completely convinced, I know that it's not really true, I still have the emotional response. So that's the best I can do right now. But maybe other people that have talked about the paradox of tragedy and so on and can comment on it. Hannah has a thought.
Maybe I'll just jump in. I don't really work on fictional emotions, but I feel like Walton gets a lot of flack for quasi emotions. So
yeah.
I feel like, so I don't think he denies the reality or the phenomenology of fictional emotions. So for instance, I can't do horror films, so I'm very alive to this possibility. I am really freaking out, right? But I think he's saying it's still different from emotion in non-fictional context, not because it's less than or unreal, but it's just a different kind of emotion. It's a quasi emotion. And I think a name might be unfortunate, but it's just a different kind because it's not action guiding, right? It doesn't really figure into our inferences about what we ought to do next. So it's a different kind of thing. Also, it's special because it feeds into your experience of the fiction, where the emotion itself becomes a prop. So that's another marker that's different from real emotion. So I think he's totally fine to agree that fiction gives us a ton of affect. One of the beautiful things about it, but it's just different from emotion as we might talk about it outside of fiction context. But the other thing was even if we think, yeah, fiction is totally pretense, I don't think it's weird that we will get emotions out of that. So like, think of all the like, I don't know, semi-cringy like recommendations people have about like your stance really matters when you want to feel confident, right? So you have to like puff your chest out, or you have to like fake it till you make it. Like there's a lot of talk about, or like manifesting your future by visualizing it and pretending that you've made it. Like it seems like there's already a lot of talk about pretense feeding into emotion, which then feeds into action and such. And so don't think it's so weird that we would know that something isn't the case, but still like feel according to how we pretend.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Pretense, yeah.
So on your first point, I agree that you see, yeah. So Walton in Fearing Fictions says, you know, when the green slime comes out of the screen, it's as though it came out of the screen to swallow you up. You're not really afraid, but you are quasi-afraid. And that just sort of seems like a label, and it has a lot of this, it agrees it has some of the same sort of physical concomitants as genuine fear. You might sort of sweat, you might cover your eyes, and so on and so forth. And just to call it quasi-fear doesn't seem to really cover it. Why do you have this emotion that's so much like fear, as opposed to having just a sign go up in your mind, fear time or something like that? And so I guess the way I was talking a minute ago makes it sound more like you might have something that is sort of indeterminate in its status as to whether it's fear or not, until you come back and, I don't know, and revisit the issue. Maybe you are tempted to run out of the theater, and then you sort of suppress that response when you realize, oh, I'm just in the movies. I mean, kids sometimes run out of the room before they develop this. Yeah. So yeah, I do think that's interesting. And of course, there is this like debate on your second point. There is this debate about emotion. You know, there's this standard view as you behave a certain way because you have a certain emotional reaction. There's this other view that says that your emotion, you know, the James Lang view of emotions, that your emotion is partly constituted by the behavior, and sort of smiling at yourself in the mirror can be a way of experiencing happiness. It can cause it, or it could even constitute it. So yeah, for both of those reasons, yeah, I suspect that Malton doesn't leave enough room for the possibility that it's just indeterminate whether we're pretending or not. That a lot of the time that we're sort of all geared up, and only later we'll decide, of course I wasn't really afraid, or yeah, I was really afraid. But it seems really bizarre that at the moment where you're confronted with the like fearsome stimulus, that you should have to like figure out right then, like whether you're quasi or really emoting. Anyway, so.
Yeah, if I could just add one very brief thing, is based on what you and Professor Kim mentioned, I would say that where pretense comes in here is upon reflection. So once like you're in the moment, I would say that pretense is out of the window. So once you reflect, like the movie or you finish the book, then you reflect upon it, then you say, okay, that did really happen. So my feelings maybe weren't as real as they would have been in other situations. So I would say this reflection component is key here.
Yeah, what you just said reminded me that Walton has this paper, I think it's called Simulation, Spelunking, and Slime, where he addresses something. He says sometimes, like, you know, suppose you're claustrophobic. So spelunking is going into these little tiny caves where you might well get stuck. And even imagining getting stuck like that makes me afraid. I remember being afraid as a kid reading about Winnie the Pooh eating too much honey in whoever it was his hole and getting stuck on the way out in the door frame, and his little arms flailing about, and he was immobilized. And so so he says, look, sometimes when I say pretense, maybe I should really say simulation. You're being at you can be as if you're fying without necessarily making as if you're fying. Making as if you're fying is being as if you're fying as a result of your deliberate efforts. But sometimes you can be as if you're fying, where the etiology of that is sort of unclear even to you. And so when you think about it in terms of simulation, supposedly a lot of our emotional life is greatly tied up with sort of simulating what another person might be feeling. You do genuinely feel happier when you see other people smile. You feel tired when you see other people yawn, and so on. Anyway, I'm trying to avoid using the word mirror neurons, and so far I've succeeded. I just mentioned the word. Okay, Jersey.
Jersey.
Thank you. Thank you for a great talk, Professor Yablo. I was wondering, so are you a logical monist in that you are saying that there is only this analysis of the sentence Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, and the implication is always the material implication, and an absurdity always explodes the system? And what if we are dealing with a logical system in which the contradiction doesn't explode the system, a paraconsistent logics? Would we have to provide a different analysis, or do you believe your analysis would work via translation to other logical systems? I guess I've tried to grasp the underlying logic that you're working with.
Right. So good. So 2 points about that. One is, I wasn't really thinking of material, the if then being material. I was thinking it was sort of the so-called indicative conditional, the kind of thing that is often thought to go with conditional probability rather than, so Ernest Adams gives this famous example, if Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, Kennedy example, if Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, someone else would have. That's probably false. There was no one there waiting to shoot Kennedy. I'm sorry to use this America-centric example, but that's a counterfactual conditional. An indicative is like, if Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, someone else did. That's true, because the guy definitely got shot. So that's the difference between or another. If I say, or consider, like, if I hadn't existed, you can make sense of that. If I don't exist, I have trouble making sense of that. Yeah. So I'm using the if I don't, if it's really the case, if the actual world is really, then what conclusions should we draw? On the second point, so it's true that not every logic has an explosion rule that says from the absurd you can get anything. But I would think even a single contradiction would be enough, because it would be, I guess it depends how far towards Gray and Priest you want to go. A contradiction, even for Priest, is not uniquely true. It's at most true and false. So the fact that you get a falsity out of it is probably bad enough. But so I was thinking, you could, I was even contemplating that you could replace the absurd symbol there with like an arbitrary falsehood. This does, which of course doesn't imply everything. This does raise an interesting question, though, which I talk about in other work a little bit, which is we want to have it presumably an intersubjectively valid content, shared content for Holmes doesn't exist. It's already not clear that indicative conditionals, understood in terms of conditional probability, give us that kind of content. Lewis and others have argued there is no proposition expressed by an indicative conditional. I was sort of just like ignoring all that. But if we say, look, Holmes does not exist is just like, if Holmes exists, then F for some falsehood F. Well, you might have some falsehood in mind that I might have a different falsehood in mind. So then I'll be, in what sense are we agreeing that Holmes exists? Well, maybe we're agreeing on the existential claim that some falsehood comes from. Anyway, I don't know, but those are good things to worry about. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. Would anyone else like to ask a question?
Maybe I can just add something about the 1997 paper by Walton that Stephen was just quoting. If I remember correctly, in that paper, Walton makes an interesting move, which is to deny that he is appealing to something like quasi-emotion in the sense that he appealed to in the previous paper, in the sense that he no longer believes that emotions in fiction are different sort of mental states, but still are exactly the very same kind of mental states as the one that we entertain outside the fiction. It simply are those mental states as entertained in the context of fiction, so to speak. So in a sense, the fear that we entertain when we are looking at the green slime is a genuine fear, but simply is a fear that is entertained in the scope or in the context of the make-believe game that which we are interacting when we are attending the movie.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that sounds interesting because it seems to deny this sort of implausible idea that there are quasi-fears which are kind of metastates that nobody understands what they actually are. Yeah. By the way, incidentally, the word quasi, which is Latin, in Latin, quasi means as if. So it shows that a quasi fear is just an as if fear, nothing more than that.
Yeah. So it seems to me it doesn't quite capture the. That's very helpful. Thank you. It seems to me it may not quite capture the phenomenon that was being people were asking about, to say that it's genuine fear in the scope of the fiction, because there's also like genuine. There could also be genuine sort of, seeing someone after a long absence in the scope of a fiction. In other words, you don't fictionally quasi see someone, you see them. But the phenomenology of within a, someone says, here she was, I haven't seen her in so many years. The phenomenology of that is nothing like the phenomenology of really seeing someone for the first time after many years. It's more like a sign, a little bit more like a sign saying, oh, you're now seeing, so it'd be it's interesting to know why fear, say, would be so hard to distinguish in the scope and outside the scope of a fiction, where other things like, say, desire may not, it might be fictional that you really want some disgusting food, but you don't like look up and say, I'm just going to stop reading this novel for a little bit so I can order like a marshmallow pie over the internet or something like that. You don't confuse the fictional desire with the real desire. Anyway, maybe there's something about the base level of emotions that, yeah, that plays a role. But, yeah. That's a good. Thank you for that. You're talking about the spelunking slime paper. Oh, thank you. Okay, that's worth revisiting then.
Awesome. More questions? So I think that's it. Thank you very much, Professor Yablo. And this is how the first international colloquium on the metaphysics and semantics of fiction ends. I would like to thank you very much for being here, especially Professors Alberto Voltolini, André Leclerc, Frederick Haraldsen, Hannah Kim, Sam Collin, Professor Steven Yablo. This colloquium was really important for all of us because, especially here in Brazil, we still have a growing community when it comes to the metaphysics and semantics of fiction. And when I say a growing community, it's some sort of euphemism because it's just like 5 or 6 guys doing the job. So we're still trying to gather our forces and become a part of the community. And I think Brazilian philosophers in general, with just a few exceptions, are under the radar when it comes to the international community. And this effort that we're making here was really fruitful in the sense that it was a pleasure to talk to some of the authors that we just knew because of the books and papers published. And it's good to see that you guys are real and you guys are around, even though this colloquium was just online. We didn't have the opportunity to meet in person, but hopefully, you know, when the pandemic is 100% over, and when the Brazilian government changes, but let's not talk about that right now. We hope that we have optimism and that the next generations of Brazilian philosophers will be even better than the previous generations, or so we hope. But I would like to thank you very, very much for being here. Not only the conferences, but also those that presented, contributed papers, or the audience that raised questions or was just around hearing us speaking and talking about fiction. It really means a lot for us. So once again, thank you very much. We are really happy that we had the opportunity to be here. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Italo, Jerzy,
Good
if
time.
I could thank both of you. This was a marvelous conference. The challenges of hosting a conference in person are steep, but to have done it online is just wonderful. So thank you to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
And of course, I would like to thank Jerzy for being here with me organizing the colloquium. If it weren't for him, this colloquium would just be an idea, like an idea that had, you know, crossed my mind and then went away, and this opportunity wouldn't have happened. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Italo. You're as I was saying at the opening, you're the one who's responsible for drawing me into the philosophy of fiction. So yes, I got very interested in your research interest. So that's great. Thank you.
Awesome. So I think the stream is over.